When hoofbeats echo through the New Mexico dusk of the 1870s, widowed Evelyn Turner faces a wounded Apache warrior, Nakai, cradling a starving infant at her door. Haunted by her own child's death, she hesitates, torn between fear and compassion. Yet one desperate word, milk, changes everything, binding her to a child and a man from a world she's been taught to dread. Will their fragile bond survive the frontier's dangers, or will it forge a family stronger than blood? Subscribe now to follow this journey of loss and redemption, and share where you're watching from. Every tale needs a listener. Can mercy heal a broken heart? Stay until the stars reveal the truth. The New Mexico sun sank low, bleeding crimson across the jagged hills, casting long shadows over the cracked earth. Evelyn Turner stood on the porch of her weathered cabin, her hands gripping a shawl tight against the evening's chill. The air carried the scent of sage and dust, sharp and unyielding, like the land itself. Her eyes, gray as gunmetal, scanned the horizon out of habit, not hope. 3 months had passed since fever stole her infant son, Noah, and years since her husband's grave took root under the lone cottonwood out back. At 32, Evelyn was a widow, carved by loss, her heart a locked gate, her only company the creak of warped boards and the howl of distant coyotes. The cabin, perched on the edge of a sparse settlement, rarely saw visitors after dusk. Strangers were trouble, drifters, outlaws, or worse. So when the thud of hoofbeats broke the silence, sharp and urgent, her hand slipped to the small pistol hidden in her skirt's folds. Her pulse quickened, steady as a drum, as she stepped to the door. The sound stopped, replaced by a heavy thump, like a sack hitting the dirt. She opened the door, slow and deliberate, her grip tight on the pistol. What stood before her wasn't a threat, but a ghost of the frontier. A tall Apache warrior, barefoot, his clothes torn and stained with blood and dust. He was gaunt, his face bruised, a deep gash on his side seeping red. But it wasn't his wounds that stopped her breath. In his arms, he cradled a bundle, a baby, no more than weeks old, its weak cries piercing the dusk. The child's lips were cracked, its skin pale as ash, searching for something it couldn't find. The warrior, Nakai, met her eyes, his own dark and desperate, holding the infant out like an offering. "Milk," he said, the word broken, raw, repeated like a prayer. Evelyn's instinct screamed to slam the door. Every tale from town, raids, savagery, stolen lives, flooded her mind. Yet this man was a raider. He was a shadow, broken by war, begging not for himself, but for the child. Her hand trembled on the pistol, her heart torn between fear and a deeper ache. She saw Noah in the baby's frail form, heard his final cries in its weakening whimpers. Her breasts, still heavy with milk, meant for a child gone, ached with a cruel reminder of her loss. To let them in was to court danger. Townsfolk would shun her, or worse. But to turn away was to bury another piece of her soul. "Come in," she whispered, her voice steady but thin, stepping aside. Nakai bowed slightly, his frame shielding the child as he crossed the threshold. Evelyn locked the door, her hands shaking, and lit a lantern, its glow casting shadows across the cabin's sparse interior. Pine table, hearth, a bed in the corner. She took the baby from Nakai's arms, its weight lighter than a breath. Unwrapping the swaddle, she saw bruises on its tiny legs, marks of a desperate journey. Nakai sank onto a bench by the hearth, his hand near a knife at his belt, not threatening but wary, a protector in a strange land. Evelyn sat in her rocking chair, the wood creaking under her, and loosened her blouse. The baby, little one, hesitated, then latched, its suckling desperate, greedy. A tear slipped down Evelyn's cheek, not from joy or pain, but from the flood of grief and purpose colliding in her chest. She rocked gently, her eyes meeting Nakai's. His face softened, the hard lines of his jaw easing, his hand falling from the knife. "Nakai," he said, touching his chest. "Evelyn," she replied, her voice barely audible. He pointed to the baby. "Little one, sister, gone. Cavalry." The words hit like stones. The child's mother was dead, killed in violence, Evelyn could only imagine. Nakai had run, bleeding, to save this life. The fire crackled, the only sound besides the baby's soft feeding. Evelyn looked down at little one, then at Nakai, his gaze steady, grateful. She didn't know what dawn would bring, danger, judgment, or worse. But in that moment, the cabin held 3 hearts, bound by a single word: milk, and a choice that felt heavier than the desert night outside. The New Mexico dawn crept slow, painting the hills in pale gold, the air sharp with the scent of dew and sagebrush. Evelyn Turner rose before the rooster, her boots soft on the cabin's creaking floorboards, the weight of last night's choice settling like dust in her bones. Nakai and little one had stirred something in her cabin, a fragile pulse of life, where only grief had lingered. She glanced at the cradle, where little one slept, swaddled in her late son's linens, his tiny chest rising steady now, no longer a ghost on the edge of fading. The Apache warrior's presence, though, was a shadow she couldn't yet name, both protector and peril under her roof. Nakai sat across the room on a woven mat, his eyes tracing the cabin's edges, hand never far from the knife at his belt. His wounds, a deep gash on his side, another on his leg, still seeped, but he bore them with a silence that spoke of years dodging death. Evelyn brewed chamomile tea, her hand steady despite the tremor in her chest, and offered him a tin cup. "It's chamomile," she said, voice low, like she was testing the air between them. Nakai took it with both hands, his fingers calloused, scarred. "Chamomile," he echoed, the word clumsy but earnest, then tapped his chest. "Nakai." He pointed to her, a faint smile breaking the hardness of his face. "Evelyn." She nodded, touching her collarbone, surprised by the warmth in his voice. A man stripped of war's weight, if only for a moment. The cabin, lit by the soft glow of a lantern, felt smaller now, its walls holding their shared silence like a vow. Little one stirred, his cries sharper, stronger, and Evelyn lifted him without hesitation, settling into the rocking chair. The baby latched greedily, his small hands clutching her blouse, and the act felt less like a burden now, more like a tether to something living. Nakai watched, his gaze soft but vigilant, as if guarding a flame that could gut her out. As morning unfolded, Evelyn cleaned Nakai's wounds, her fingers careful over the jagged gash. He didn't flinch, his eyes telling stories she didn't ask to hear, of fire, flight, and a sister lost to cavalry steel. She wrapped his side with torn linens, her touch steady, though her mind wrestled with the risk. Townsfolk would brand her a traitor for this, their whispers already sharp as thorns. Yet Nakai's trust, his lack of resistance, carved a crack in her guarded heart. She handed him a scrap of paper, scribbling water and sounding it out. He repeated it, then pointed outside, murmuring an Apache word for the stream that ran beyond the cottonwood. "Geo," he said, and she tried it, her tongue stumbling but willing. The exchange grew, a word for a word, a bridge built from scraps. Evelyn taught him bread, fire, while Nakai gave her "we kon iwe dabi" for star, "we kon iwe ka iwek" for wind. Each syllable was a step, cautious but deliberate, across the divide between their worlds. Little one's cries, now robust, filled the gaps, his hunger a rhythm that bound them. Evelyn caught Nakai humming to the baby, a low, mournful tune that seemed to rise from the earth itself. "Sister's song," he said, when he noticed her listening, his voice heavy with memory. "Beautiful," she replied, and meant it, the sound weaving through the cabin like a thread pulling tight. By midday, Evelyn stepped outside to check the garden, her hands brushing sage and mint, the earth warm under her fingers. Nakai followed, carrying little one, his eyes scanning the hills for threats. "You watch always," she said, not a question. He nodded, his gaze distant. "Cavalry. Always come." The words landed like stones, a reminder of the danger she'd invited in. She didn't ask about his sister, didn't press the wounds his silence guarded, but she felt their weight. The town's judgment loomed, a shadow as real as the dust on her boots. If they knew an Apache slept under her roof, they'd come with more than words. Inside, little one napped, his face fuller, his breaths a quiet defiance of death. Evelyn sat by the hearth, mending a torn blanket, while Nakai sharpened his knife with slow, precise strokes. The fire's crackle filled the silence, but it wasn't empty. It hummed with a fragile trust, woven from milk, shared words, and the baby's growing strength. Evelyn looked at Nakai, his hand steady, his eyes no longer wary. The cabin, once a grave for her grief, now held a spark of something else, a bond, invisible but strong, tying three souls to a fight not yet named. The New Mexico sun climbed high, baking the red earth and casting sharp shadows across Evelyn Turner's cabin. The spark of trust kindled between her, Nakai, and little one hummed quietly, like a fire banked for the night. But the world outside pressed closer, its edges jagged with suspicion. Evelyn stood at the kitchen window, her hand still dusted with flour from kneading dough, watching Nakai sharpen a stick into a toy for little one. The baby's laughter, stronger now, rang through the yard, a sound that both warmed her and sharpened her dread. The town's gaze was turning, and she felt its weight like a storm gathering on the horizon. She rode into the settlement that morning, her mule kicking up dust along the rutted trail to fetch flour and lamp oil. The general store smelled of leather and tobacco, its shelves lined with jars and bolts of cloth. But the air shifted when Evelyn stepped inside. Conversations hushed, eyes darted. The shopkeeper, a wiry man with a gray mustache, nodded curtly, but the women at the counter exchanged glances, their whispers sharp as thorns. "Saw her with someone dark," one muttered. "Not a drifter. Looked Indian." Another clucked. "Ain't been right since her boy passed." Evelyn's hands tightened on her basket, her chin high, but her heart thudded. She paid, left without a word, and rode home, the reins trembling in her grip. Back at the cabin, the air felt heavier, the walls too thin to hold back the world. Little one napped in the cradle, his small fists curled, his face fuller with each passing day. Nakai sat by the hearth, carving a wooden bird, his knife moving with quiet precision. Evelyn set the supplies down, her voice low but steady. "They know," she said, meeting his eyes. "Or they think they do." Nakai's hand stilled, his gaze flicking to the door, then back to her. "I go," he said, his voice like gravel, ready to vanish into the night. Evelyn's jaw tightened. "No," she said, sharper than she meant. "You're not just a stranger anymore. That child—" She glanced at little one, sleeping soundly. "He's not just yours now." Nakai's eyes softened, a rare crack in his guarded mask. He set the carving down, his fingers tracing its edges. "You risk much," he said, the words heavy with unspoken debt. Evelyn sank into a chair, her hands folding tight in her lap. "I've lost everything once. I won't watch you die out there. Not with him needing you. The fire popped, its light dancing across the cabin, casting their shadows long and intertwined. Nakai leaned forward, his voice low. My sister, Tui Weishomyi, cavalry took her. Left little one. I ran to you, heard of woman who cries by grave. Evelyn's breath caught. The town's gossip, now a blade turned inward. Her grief had been loud enough to reach a stranger's ears. She stood, pacing to the window, the hills blurring in her vision. They'll come, she said, her voice steady but cold. Not just talk. Men with guns. Nakai nodded, his hand resting on his knife. I know their kind. Always come. The words landed like stones, echoing the danger that had chased him to her door. Evelyn turned, her eyes meeting his, searching for the man beneath the warrior. Why'd you trust me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nakai's gaze held hers, steady as the earth. Heard you lost son. Knew you had milk. Knew you had heart. The simplicity of it cut deeper than any sermon, her loss a bridge to his. Little one stirred, his soft cry breaking the tension. Evelyn lifted him, her hands sure now, and settled him against her breast. The baby's suckling was a rhythm, a pulse that bound them in the quiet. Nakai watched, his carving forgotten, and murmured, Tui we kong I sang to him. You sing too? Evelyn shook her head, but a faint hum escaped her lips, a lullaby she'd sung to Noah. Nakai joined, his voice low, an Apache melody weaving with hers, their songs blending like streams meeting a river. The cabin, once a tomb for her sorrow, now held a fragile harmony, a defiance against the whispers closing in. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the mesquite, carrying the scent of dust and warning. Evelyn looked at Nakai, his hand steady, his eyes no longer just wary but resolute. The town's suspicions were a noose tightening, but in that moment, the cabin was theirs. A sanctuary built on milk, trust, and the heartbeat of a child who refused to fade. They weren't ready for what came next, but they would face it, bound by an invisible thread, stronger than fear. The New Mexico noon burned fierce, the sun a relentless eye over the red hills, casting the cabin in stark light and shadow. Evelyn Turner stood by the cradle, her hand resting on little one's chest, his steady breaths, a quiet rebellion against the fear tightening her throat. The town's whispers had grown teeth, and the sanctuary she'd built with Nakai and the child now felt like a trap ready to spring. Outside, Nakai scanned the horizon, his knife glinting as he tested its edge, his silence louder than the wind rattling the mesquite. They were bound by an invisible thread, but the world was closing in, and Evelyn knew they couldn't stay. Dust rose in the distance, a faint cloud signaling riders, too fast, too purposeful for traitors. Evelyn's pulse quickened, her eyes meeting Nakai's. They're coming, she said, her voice low, like a warning carved in stone. Nakai nodded, his gaze sharp as a hawk's, and moved to the cellar door, lifting it with a creak. But before they could hide, hoofbeats thundered closer, and the sheriff's voice cut through the air. Miss Turner, he called, flanked by 2 ranchers and a deputy, rifles slung across their saddles. We need to talk. Evelyn stepped onto the porch, her shotgun cradled loose but ready, her chin high. Talk don't need guns, she said, her tone cold as the desert night. The sheriff, a lean man with eyes like flint, tipped his hat. Folks say you're hiding an Apache. Footprints don't lie. Evelyn's heart thudded, but her face stayed stone. Jackrabbits and wind, that's all you'll find here. The scarred rancher beside him sneered, his hand twitching toward his rifle. Neighbor saw a shadow, bigger'n a drifter. Evelyn's grip tightened. Then he ought to mind his own field. The sheriff raised a hand, his voice steady but edged. "We'll be back with papers, ma'am. Don't make this harder." They turned, dust trailing their retreat, but Evelyn knew time was slipping like sand through her fingers. Inside, Nakai emerged from the cellar, little one in his arms, his face unreadable but taut. "They hunt me," he said, his voice low. "You safe if I go?" Evelyn shook her head, her jaw set. "Not without you. Not without him." She glanced at little one, his eyes bright, unaware of the danger. The cabin, once her refuge, now felt like a cage. She moved fast, gathering blankets, jerky, and a map her husband had scratched years ago. But as night fell, a lone rider lingered near the woods, a bounty hunter, his horse circling, eyes sharp. Evelyn's mind raced. They needed a diversion, something to buy time. She slipped outside, her boots silent on the dirt, and piled dry brush at the forest's edge. With a flint, she sparked a fire, small but bright, its smoke curling high to draw the hunter's gaze. Nakai watched from the shadows, understanding without words, and nodded. As the flames crackled, pulling the rider's attention, Evelyn, Nakai, and little one slipped through the back, the mule loaded with their meager supplies. The cottonwood loomed behind, its branches heavy with the weight of her husband's grave, her son's memory. Evelyn paused, her hand brushing the tree's bark, then turned away. The past was gone. The child in her arms was now. They moved into the wilderness, the night swallowing the cabin's silhouette. The trail was rough, winding through mesquite and rock, the air thick with the scent of dust and fear. Nakai led, his steps sure, his knife at his side, while Evelyn cradled little one, his warmth a steady anchor. The stars burned cold above, the only witnesses to their flight. If this tale of courage and sacrifice stirs your heart, subscribe to keep these stories alive and share where you're listening from. We're all bound by the threads of the frontier. The bounty hunter's fire glowed faint behind them, a false beacon fading as they pressed deeper into the dark. The forest closed around them, its shadows both shield and threat. Evelyn's heart pounded, not just from fear, but from the weight of leaving everything. Home, safety, the grave she'd tended daily. Nakai glanced back, his eyes meeting hers, a silent promise that they weren't running blind. Little one stirred, his soft coo a reminder of why they fled. The night stretched endless, the trail unyielding, but they moved as one, their steps a quiet vow to protect the life they carried, no matter what lay ahead. The New Mexico night stretched vast and merciless, its stars cold pinpricks above the jagged hills. Evelyn Turner clung to little one, his small body warm against her chest as she followed Nakai through the wilderness, their mule trailing with a soft clop of hooves. The false fire's glow had faded behind them, a fleeting trick that bought their escape from the bounty hunter's gaze. But the desert was no friend. It offered no shelter, only endless scrub and rock, its silence a threat as real as the riders they'd left behind. Evelyn's heart beat steady, driven not by fear, but by the weight of the child in her arms and the man leading her into the unknown. The trail twisted through a maze of mesquite and boulder, the air thick with dust and the sharp tang of creosote. Nakai moved like a shadow, his steps silent, his eyes scanning the dark for signs of pursuit. Evelyn matched his pace, her boots scuffing the red earth, her breath short but resolute. Little one stirred, his soft coo a fragile anchor in the vastness. Nakai paused, sniffing the air, then pointed to a dry creek bed. "Hide here," he whispered, his voice low as the wind. They crouched among the rocks, the mule tethered close, as distant hoofbeats echoed. A patrol, too close, their lanterns flickering like wolves' eyes in the night. Dawn broke, pale and unforgiving, revealing a landscape scorched by sun and time. Nakai led them deeper into the desert, teaching Evelyn to read the land, scuff marks on stone, bent twigs, the faint whiff of smoke that meant danger. "Listen to wind," he said, his hand tracing the air. "It speaks of men." Evelyn nodded, her ears straining for the telltale rustle of pursuit. She learned fast, tying pine boughs to cover their tracks, sparking fire with flint and stone when they camped in hidden hollows. Nakai showed her how to weave reeds into traps for fish, their meager meals shared under starlight, little ones' growing strength a quiet victory. One night, beneath a sky heavy with constellations, they rested in a shallow cave, its walls cool against their backs. Little one giggled, tugging at Nakai's sleeve, and Evelyn's heart lifted, a rare lightness cutting through the weight of their flight. "Why'd you trust me?" she asked, her voice soft, the question burning since the cabin. Nakai's eyes met hers, steady as the desert itself. "Heard you cry by son's grave. Knew your milk lived. Knew your heart did too." The words landed like a stone in still water, her grief a beacon that had called him across the divide. Evelyn's throat tightened, tears pricking her eyes, not for sorrow, but for the truth that her pain had saved a life. They pressed on, crossing rivers that barely wet their boots, hiding in thickets when bounty hunters' voices carried on the wind. One afternoon, they lay flat in a gully, dust coating their faces, as a rider passed above, his curses sharp as spurs. Evelyn held little one close, his warmth a shield against fear, while Nakai's hand rested on his knife, ready but still. The danger passed, but the desert tested them. Blistering days, freezing nights, hunger gnawing at their bones. Yet moments of joy broke through. Little one's laugh when Nakai dangled a grass-woven toy, or Evelyn's soft hum blending with Nakai's Apache lullaby, their voices a fragile harmony under the endless sky. By the 10th day, the land grew harsher, the hills sharper, the air dry as bone. Nakai's pace quickened, his eyes fixed on a distant canyon. "Close now," he said, his voice taut with hope and dread. Evelyn felt it too, the weight of their journey's end, the uncertainty of what awaited. Little one, stronger now, reached for her face, his tiny fingers tracing her cheek. She smiled, her resolve hard as the red rock around them. They weren't just running from danger. They were running toward a place that might reject them, a people who might see her as an enemy. But the child in her arms, the man at her side, gave her no choice but to keep moving. The trail narrowed, the canyon walls looming closer, their shadows swallowing the sun. Nakai glanced back, his gaze a silent vow that they'd face whatever came together. Evelyn clutched little one, his heartbeat a rhythm against her own, and stepped forward, the desert's vastness both a threat and a promise. The Apache camp lay ahead, hidden in the rocks, a world she didn't know but would fight to enter, for the sake of the life they carried. The New Mexico dawn broke sharp, its pale light carving through the canyon's jagged walls, painting the red rock in hues of fire and shadow. Evelyn Turner clutched little one close, his warmth a steady pulse against her chest as she followed Nakai down a narrow ravine. The desert trail had forged them, warrior, widow, and child, into a unit bound by survival. But now the Apache camp lay just beyond, a hidden world that could either embrace or reject them. Nakai's steps quickened, his eyes fixed on the path, but Evelyn felt the weight of uncertainty, heavy as the dust on her boots. They weren't running anymore. They were stepping into a reckoning. The canyon opened into a sheltered valley, its floor dotted with low lodges and curling smoke, nestled like secrets in the rock's embrace. Figures moved, women grinding corn, children darting between tents, warriors standing sentinel with bows drawn. Nakai raised a hand, his voice low, speaking words Evelyn didn't know, but felt in her bones. Two young warriors emerged from the shadows, faces painted, eyes narrowing at her pale skin and the child in her arms. One ran ahead, the other gestured them forward, his gaze hard as flint. Evelyn tightened her grip on little one, his soft coo a quiet defiance against the tension in the air. The camp stirred as they entered, eyes turning, whispers rippling like wind through mesquite. A woman pulled her children close, another crossed herself, her face tight with fear. Nakai walked steady, his head high, but Evelyn felt the weight of their stares, some shocked, others hostile, all measuring her as an outsider. Little one shifted, his tiny hand clutching her shawl, and she straightened, her chin up, her heart pounding like a drum. An elder woman stepped from a lodge, tall and thin, her white hair braided, her shawl embroidered with bird feathers, her eyes, clouded but sharp, locked on Nakai. "My son," she said in Apache, touching his arm. "You return." Nakai bowed his head. "With little one, my sister's son." He stepped aside, gesturing to Evelyn. "She gave milk, kept him alive." The elder, Shima, turned to Evelyn, her gaze piercing, as if reading the scars beneath her skin. The crowd murmured, some shaking their heads, one man spitting into the dirt. Evelyn stood firm, her arms steady around little one, but her chest tightened, the valley's air thick with distrust. Shima raised a hand, silencing the whispers. "She carries mourning," she said, her voice low but commanding, placing a hand over Evelyn's heart. "Like a mother who buried her young." Evelyn swallowed hard, her voice a whisper. "I have, and I'll keep this one alive." Shima's eyes held hers, weighing her words, then nodded, a gesture heavy with unspoken judgment. The camp didn't soften, but it stilled, watching as Evelyn was led to a lodge. She was no guest. Tasks came fast, fetching water from a distant stream, gathering firewood, mending torn hides. It was a test, unspoken but clear, her worth measured in sweat and silence. She worked without complaint, her hands raw, her back aching, little one tied to her chest, his growing strength her anchor. One evening, a child in the camp fell ill, his fever burning hot under the star-lit sky. Evelyn knelt beside him, her hands mixing wild mint and willow bark into a tea, her movements sure from years of tending her own. The boy's mother watched, wary but desperate, as the fever broke by dawn. Whispers shifted, less venom, more curiosity. "She knows healing," a woman said, her voice soft as sagebrush. Shima began speaking to Evelyn through Nakai, sharing stories of betrayal, of treaties broken, of a sister lost. Evelyn spoke of Noah, her son, and how little one had pulled her from grief's edge. Each word was a stone laid in a fragile bridge. Nakai stood before the fire one night, his voice steady, his hand on his chest. "She is mother," he said to the tribe, "not by blood, but by milk and spirit." The words landed like sparks, some faces softening, others still hard as canyon rock. Little one, now toddling, reached for Evelyn, calling Mama in a mix of Apache and English, his voice a blade through the camp's doubt. Evelyn's heart swelled, but the valley's edge held shadows. Cavalry scouts were near, their threat a low hum in the wind. She looked to Nakai, his eyes resolute, and knew the fight for this home was far from over. The New Mexico Valley lay hushed under a dawn sky, its canyon walls glowing red, as if kissed by fire. Evelyn Turner stood at the edge of the Apache camp, little one asleep in her arms, his soft breaths a quiet defiance against the threat creeping closer. Nakai's words, proclaiming her a mother by milk and spirit, still echoed, but the camp's fragile acceptance hung like dew on a spider's web, ready to vanish with the sun. Scouts had returned at midnight, their faces grim, reporting cavalry patrols circling the outer ridges, their hoofbeats a drumroll of war. Evelyn's heart thudded, not with fear, but with a resolve hard as the canyon rock. She would not let this family, this home, be torn apart. The camp stirred, warriors sharpening arrows, women whispering prayers, but Evelyn's mind raced to a different path. Fighting would only fuel the cavalry's wrath, branding the tribe as savages. She turned to Nakai, his eyes scanning the horizon, his knife glinting in the early light. "I'm going to them," she said, her voice steady as the earth. Nakai's gaze snapped to her, sharp as a hawk's. "They'll kill you," he said, his voice low, taut. Evelyn shook her head, cradling little one. "Not if I speak first. Not if I make them see." Nakai's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, his silence a grudging trust. She rode out alone at first light, her mule trudging through the winding canyons, her medicine pouch slung across her chest. No gun, only words, and the herbs she'd learned to wield. The desert stretched vast, its red dirt baking under a sun that offered no mercy. By midday, she reached the cavalry camp near a river bend, its tents stark against the sagebrush, soldiers' rifles glinting like teeth. Dust coated her face, her shawl frayed, but she dismounted with her chin high, a widow turned emissary. The men stared, some like she was a ghost, others with hands twitching toward their weapons. "I come to talk," she said, her voice clear, cutting through their murmurs. The commanding officer, a grizzled man with a scar across his brow, stepped forward, his eyes narrow. "Evelyn Turner," he said, recognizing the widow who'd vanished. "You've got nerve riding in alone." She stood firm, her hand steady. "I've got truth. The people you hunt ain't warriors. They're families, hiding to live." She spoke of Nakai, a man who ran bleeding to save a child, of Little One, an orphan kept alive by her milk, of a tribe weary of war. The soldiers scoffed, but a young officer, pale and sweating, watched her, his breath shallow with fever. "You're asking us to ignore a hostile camp," the commander said, his voice hard as flint. "I'm asking you to see people, not enemies," Evelyn replied, her gaze unwavering. She stepped to the sick officer, her hands moving to her pouch. "Let me help him, and you'll hear me out." The commander hesitated, then nodded, his men watching as she mixed willow bark and mint into a tea. The officer drank, his fever easing by dusk, his eyes clearer. The camp grew quiet, the soldiers' mockery fading. Evelyn spoke again, her words raw, woven with the pain of her own loss and the hope she'd found in Little One. "They want peace, same as you. Give them time to live it." The commander's face softened, not with trust, but with doubt, a crack in his resolve. He sent a messenger to the main post, requesting a delay. No promises, just time. Evelyn rode back under a sky-bruised purple, her body battered by the journey, her heart heavy but unbroken. The canyon welcomed her, its walls a shield, as she entered the camp. Little One ran to her, his arms wide, his voice bright with "Mama" in Apache and English. She knelt, pulling him close, his warmth a fire against the chill of what she'd done. Nakai stood nearby, his eyes meeting hers, a silent acknowledgement of her courage. The tribe gathered, Shima's voice rising over the fire. "She spoke for us," she said, her braided hair gleaming. "She carried our lives to the enemy's door." Murmurs of respect rippled, the camp's suspicion easing like dust settling after a storm. Nakai carved a mark beside their lodge, a wolf beside a bird, their bond etched in wood. The cavalry's shadow lingered, but for now, the valley held its breath. Safe in the fragile peace Evelyn had bought with her words and her heart, the New Mexico spring unfurled gently, its warm winds softening the canyon's sharp edges, the valley alive with the hum of life reclaimed. Evelyn Turner stood among the Apache lodges, little one toddling at her side. His laughter, a bright spark against the red rock. The fragile peace she'd won by facing the cavalry held. A breath held against the threat of war. Nakai's carved wolf and bird gleamed on their lodge, a silent testament to their bond. But the camp's eyes now turned to her with respect, not suspicion. Evelyn had crossed a divide, not just of worlds, but of her own heart, and the valley was no longer a refuge. It was home. The tribe moved with the rhythm of renewal, women weaving baskets, children chasing fireflies under a sky stitched with stars. Evelyn learned their ways, her hands grinding corn, mixing herbs under Shima's watchful eye. She taught the children English letters, scratching them in the dirt, while they taught her Apache songs, their voices blending like streams in a river. Little one, sturdy now, ran between tents, his words a mix of mama and Apache phrases, his joy a bridge between worlds. Yet Evelyn carried a quiet ache. Her son Noah's grave lay far behind, but his memory lived in every lullaby she sang. One evening, the tribe gathered for a spring ceremony, fires blazing, their light dancing on the canyon walls. Shima stood tall, her white braid gleaming, her voice carrying over the crackle of flames. "Some mothers are born of blood," she said, her eyes on Evelyn. "Others from loss, from courage. She is one." The tribe nodded, their silence a vow, not of law, but of spirit. They called her Diwekomyi, woman who nurtures, a name earned through milk and sacrifice. Evelyn's throat tightened, her hand resting on little one's head, his warmth grounding her in this new world. Nakai stood beside her, no longer the wary warrior, but a man at ease, his strength now in guiding, not fighting. He hunted with the men, taught boys to track deer, but always returned to their fire, where Evelyn and little one waited. Their bond wasn't spoken, but it lived in small acts, his carved toys for the child, her mending his torn shirt, their shared glances over the fire's glow. One night, as little one slept, Evelyn asked, "Will he know his mother? Your sister?" Nakai's eyes traced the stars. "He knows her in you," he said, his voice low, steady. "Her spirit lives in his laugh." The seasons turned, the valley a haven untouched by the cavalry's shadow. Evelyn wove a quilt for little one, each patch a story, her son's, Nakai's sisters, her own. She shared tales with Shima, learning of broken treaties, of a people who fought to breathe free. In return, she spoke of her husband, of a cabin that once held dreams now buried. The women of the camp no longer turned away. They nodded, shared their fires, their stories. Children trailed Evelyn, curious, tugging her shawl, and she laughed, a sound she'd thought lost forever. But peace was fragile, a flame flickering in the wind. Scouts reported distant hoofbeats, whispers of soldiers circling closer. The tribe prepared, arrows sharpened, prayers whispered. But Evelyn felt a new strength, not just to survive, but to protect. She sat with Nakai one night, the fire low, little one curled in her lap. "If they come," she said, her voice steady as the canyon rock, "we stand together." Nakai's hand brushed hers, not possessive but sure, a silent vow. "You are blood now," he said, echoing his words from the camp's fire, but heavier, truer. The valley glowed under the moon, its lodges a patchwork of hope and resilience. Evelyn tucked little one into his blanket, whispering, "You'll never be alone. Not while I breathe." The words were a promise, not just to the child, but to herself, to Nakai, to the tribe that had named her. The desert stretched beyond, vast and unforgiving, but within these walls, a family had grown, not born of blood, but of loss, trust, and courage. The wolf and bird stood carved above their lodge, watching over a home forged in the heart of the frontier, where love and survival burned brighter than any star. Evelyn's journey, from a widow's grief to a mother's courage in the New Mexico wilds, weaves a tale of mercy and unbreakable bonds. What stirred in your heart as little one found a home? Share your thoughts. Where did this story take you, and what does family mean in your world? Your voices keep these frontier fires burning. I'm grateful for every moment you've ridden this trail with us, through dust and hope. Stay for the next tale, where the desert whispers of resilience and love under star-lit skies. We'll meet again, where courage carves a path